Hey guys, do you want to help spread the truth of the gospel online? Do you want to help those who are only hearing half-truths about our faith? Well, now you can. Whenever you see something misrepresenting the restored gospel online, you can take action and submit it to us for a debunk by visiting thoughtfulfaith.org or by using the submission link in the video description below. By sending us a link, you can be part of our movement to stop the online misrepresentations and help spread the truth about the restored gospel.
One of the hardest things emotionally and mentally is to face the truth that is uncomfortable to you, right? Alternatively, if we avoid the truth and push it away and deny it, like, I don't want to even think about that, we're just going to stay stuck.
So I recently sat down with my friend Jacob Hess. Jacob is a doctor of community psychology, a mindfulness teacher, and a writer at Deseret News. His book, The Power of Stillness at Deseret Book, is a gospel-centered paradigm changer for Latter-day Saints feeling mentally overwhelmed. People today often run between two extremes. Either they are in a mental health crisis, or else they don't really think that much about mental health. However, the conversation that follows is ultimately for everyone, because even if you are not experiencing a mental health crisis, you can significantly improve your well-being through the ideas that Jacob talks about in this video. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Today we're going to be talking about mental health, and specifically mental health as it relates to the church and a lot of different things. But before we get into that, you were telling me about this card game that you've developed. It's specifically for kids, right?
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about it.
Well, I've been teaching teenagers and adults mindfulness for a number of years prior to getting into journalism, and mostly people that are stressed out of their minds, that are just trying to learn to, okay, I'm hurting so much inside. I need to kind of learn how to approach all this differently. But the question always comes up, what about kids? There's a lot of children dealing with not just sadness and fear, anxiety, but anger issues. I hear from parents whose kids are just like terrorizing the family. So there's this idea in Eastern cultures that the mind is like a horse that you can train. And we experience emotions in the West sometimes like, they're out of our control. They just take over and we're just swept downstream. But there's this beautiful idea that we can actually train the mind like you would train a horse. And similar, also, Elder Maxwell's talked about educating the heart, like not just the mind, but the heart. So when I try to teach this to kids, I say it's kind of like a puppy dog that's rambunctious and going in all these different places. You might not always like what it's doing, but instead of just yelling at the puppy dog, instead of getting angry at the puppy dog or trying to force it to do what you want it to do, obviously that doesn't work, right? So we can train it, we can guide it. So the whole game, called Train Your Puppy, there's cards. I mean, how old are your kids?
So they range anywhere from 5 to 11.
Oh, perfect. They're like perfect age. So
I was about to say, you're talking about this, and I'm thinking about my daughter, Dixie, and bless her heart, love her to death, sweetest little, daddy's little princess. But I'll tell you what, I'm learning about like some of the emotional stuff and like getting a grip on some of that. And I've been like, not that like, oh, she needs therapy or something, but more like, are there things that we can do as parents to kind of, I always, and I told my kids this, I said, your mom and dad are your therapist. The only time I need to go get a therapist is if I'm unable to kind of do the therapy work myself of keep helping my kid to emotionally regulate well and all that kind of stuff. And it sounds to me like this is a resource to people like me.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it's an educational tool for parents to be able to teach these things to their kids, really. It's like through a game format, it gives you a chance to have these new conversations, whether you're parent, grandparent, teacher. So these cards are face down in the center, and everybody brings a stuffed animal, okay? And And I know you secretly have a favorite stuffed animal locked in your treasure box somewhere, Jacob. So you're gonna have to find it, bring it, and then, you know, your daughter picks, let's see, disappointed pup. This puppy's disappointed. And so the first question is, all right, what would you do to your stuffed animal if they were disappointed? Show us. Just let her talk. And then let everybody else, all the other kids, talk. And then at some point I encourage you or the other adults to say something like, well, you wouldn't get mad at this puppy for being disappointed? Your animal, you wouldn't like shake it, say, stop being disappointed, you know? And obviously not, right? When you think about it this way, it makes no sense to be harsh with a little puppy, to like try to control it. But that's what we do with our minds sometimes. We think we can just like fight them and wrestle them to the ground. So the next part of the game, you say, well, have you ever felt disappointed? And then you have a conversation with everybody and have this conversation about how do you respond to disappointment? When your own mind and heart feels this way, how can we respond in a gentle way? And at the end of the game, or at the end of the round, you say, all right, we've heard from everybody. Who would be the best puppy trainer for this puppy? And everybody gets a vote. And then whoever is the best trainer gets this card. And the winner, you know, whoever gets the most cards wins. But the real point is not to get the cards. It's to communicate this lesson that if we can train a little puppy who's rambunctious over time with patience, gentleness, kindness, we can do the same with our minds. Like imagine if we approached all this stuff inside like depression instead of like, oh no, you're depressed. Jacob, we've got to do something to make it go away. We've got to like be really aggressive with that depression. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Oxford psychologist Mark Williams says the mind does not like to be forced. And if we try to just force something to go away, that's what we love to do in America. We like go to war with our emotions or go to war. There's a backlash. It doesn't actually work. Over time, some of our short-term aggressive interventions have a big cost later on. So that's the point of the game, is to start a new conversation as a family. And because this is a little challenging, I put all the best advice I know on how to do this in your own home in this little guide with pictures.
Nice.
And so it like includes a lot of tips for families who are trying to like do this in their home, including like my best ideas on how to bring stillness into a life of faith. It's like, you know, it's the old joke. Well, okay, you've got young kids. Your life is going to be chaotic constantly. And so we give up on the possibility of creating kind of a sanctuary in our home. So it's been a lot of fun. If people order before Tuesday, I can get it to them before Christmas. So
awesome. Well, no, it sounds like a great little gift idea. What's the website? Because I'm actually gonna order one after this.
Yeah, www.trainyourpuppygame.com, and I'll send you a link that you can include as well for people.
Perfect. I'll put it in the show notes, everybody, so you guys can go and order a copy of this. And it sounds like the question to ask, and you know, kind of for me, is like, are you dealing with a child that has emotional sort of regulation issues, or that is you know, is that kind of the thing that a parent needs to ask? Like, am I dealing with a child that has that sort of an issue?
Yeah, which is pretty much every child I know on some level, right? Like childhood is like learning to manage emotions, and a lot of adults I know haven't like learned how to do this. So I hope it's like opens up a new conversation at home, and yeah, we appreciate your letting us share a little bit about it.
Perfect. And actually, I want to kind of pivot from that to maybe a more adult conversation on that same topic. And in fact, I think I did a video on this a while back. People look at my channel. So mental health, huge topic right now. Everyone's talking about. And in my family, personally, in my extended family, we've been really, really blessed in that we have really good physical health. Very little disease or serious illnesses and things like that, you know. Thank the good Lord for that. However, mental health has been a different story in our family, especially as people get older. And it's funny because I have a relative of mine that had a serious mental health kind of crisis, like really bad. Um, and we have some bipolar issues in our family and things like that that have existed. And it's funny because back up one step. My brother told me that he had done. He's a doctor, and when he's doing his medical rounds, you have to do like a psychiatry round, I think. And he learned a lot about mental health, and he was sharing something with me, and it stuck with me to this day. He said everybody has anxiety, everybody has depression. The only question is like, is it at a level that it kind of gets out of control
Mm.
and begins to take over your life? And I began to realize, I was like, wait a minute. And as I've gotten older, I've noticed it's worse. I started noticing that I would swing more. Like I would feel more depressed. Or on the other hand, the mania side, we're feeling like hyper productive, hyper aware, hyper just like woo, like that. And it's really exciting to be on that, right? But then there's like a crash on the other side.
Yeah.
And I began to notice that in my own head. And I was like, and a lot of people think, at least in my mind, this is just I'm giving you kind of my update. Obviously, you've studied this way more than me and things. Just kind of my frame, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. But I had this idea in my head of, well, I don't want to go, like, if I'm really sick physically, I'll go to the doctor and I'll like get actual like chemicals to put into my body to help me feel better, to heal things or whatever. And I think the same thing can be for mental health. If someone's in a real condition where they need something like that, I have no judgment towards that at all. However, I also am someone who believes in, if you don't need the medicine, don't take it. And if you can regulate your body through good, health habits generally, exercise and good diet, well, then I'll be more healthy physically. And I began to ask myself the question, well, what's the equivalent of diet and exercise for mental health? Like, what are the things that I can do
Mm-hmm.
that actually help my mental health? Now, I've come to some conclusions on that, but before I give any of my thoughts or the things that I've discovered, how would you answer that question as someone who's a mental health professional?
Well, man, that's like a triple barrel question. I mean, for starters, diet and exercise are pretty good for mental health
Yeah,
too.
I've heard
I
that.
don't know if you've been eating like a gallon of eggnog a day, you know, sugar can kind of like shift our mood pretty dramatically.
Hmm.
But salt and caffeine can really bring on anxiety. Um, the food colors, the bright food colors that cause Doritos to look like they've been through a nuclear attack, those are so consistently tied with attention problems that in the UK they ban them for all foods. You can't find food that looks like it does in America in the UK. I've
Huh.
I've seen these studies. They're dramatic, right? And so,
And
yeah, not just
I just want to pause here for you saying that, because the thing is that I know you, Jacob, and my audience might not. Now, there are guys out there who are kind of like really hardcore about like food coloring needs to be taken away and all that stuff, or this kind of things. And I know that Jacob Hess is like one of the most even keeled, level headed dudes out there. So when he's saying it, that means something to me.
well, look, I'm married to an herbologist. I have to sneak out late at night to just get a hamburger. So just in fairness, I'm not. I tease my wife. My diet is mostly healthy. You got to have a little. But just to give you an idea, there's a study out of Australia. They took people with depression, and if the only thing you changed was your diet, and you're struggling with depression, there is a measurable impact, like a sizable measurable. Everything else stays the same, but you shift your diet. And the same is true for exercise. If the only thing you change is the level of physical activity, they've done these studies, right? Head to head with an antidepressant, they show a comparable effect in the short term. And in the long term, it blows away the medication because long term, many medications have been shown to be effective in the short term. We've studied them in the short term mostly. If you look long term, not so great. In fact, every one of the 21 studies I've gathered for antidepressants long term, they suggest that people should probably taper at some point. Like
Hmm.
staying on them for 15 years,
See,
not usually gonna lead you in a great place. They were tested and approved at the FDA for short-term use.
See, it's funny because to use the analogy that I kind of was talking about there, it's kind of like imagine someone is taking a painkiller forever. It's like, wait a
Yeah,
minute here. Isn't it better to like actually fix the source of the pain, like the
yeah.
underlying stuff?
But actually, there's studies on that too. If you did that, and people do it, you know that.
Hmm.
There's something called pain sensitivity. I spoke to a physician the other day about this, where your sensitivity to pain at year 5 of painkillers and 10 gets worse. And so you actually feel physical pain more. And this is one of the dirty secrets of mental health, that if you actually stay on an anti-anxiety or antidepressant or even antipsychotic, it is very clear in the medical literature that people are more anxious later on, more depressed, more psychotic. Putting kids on ADHD meds for 10 years is not a great idea if you're actually just looking at the plain research. But if we use them thoughtfully for a time and then get off, we're much more likely to have better outcomes. But listen, this is not an anti-medication perspective. They have an important use, and doctors can play an important role in that. But to finish what I was saying earlier, here's the exciting thing. The real exciting thing is this. If the only thing you changed was sleep, there's a study out of Harvard that one half an hour, if you go to bed just half an hour earlier or an hour earlier, there is a measurable, it's like 15 or 10% decrease in your depression risk. Just changing your sleep, right? And so here's the most exciting thing. If you add those all up, let's say you don't just do one thing, you make adjustments with your sleep, adjustments with your health. Maybe you just, have a little bit of eggnog. Don't totally go health Nazi. Get out, get physical activity, get some sunlight, decrease your stress, connect more with people. The combination of those adjustments is huge. And I'm talking about Neil Nedley. There's a couple of people who have done these studies. Neil Nedley and then Stephen Alardi out at Kansas. I interviewed Stephen Alardi for an article a year ago. And Jacob, we're talking about huge effects. Stephen Alardi says he has never had a single person come through his clinic where he helps them make all these changes, right? He actually has a coach and they'll help you. He's never had a single person whose depression hasn't been cut in half, ever, including people who didn't get effects from other places. Neil Nedley has found that if you can get the lifestyle risks down from like 14 to like 4 or 5, let's say there's still some lifestyle stuff that you haven't been able to improve. But if you can just reduce the amount of risk factors, the depression most often lifts and goes away for good. I mean, this just doesn't happen.
Wow.
This is like magical fairyland for a lot of people. But we're talking about outcomes that last. So this is called therapeutic lifestyle change. It's been piloted in these sort of different programs. There's books about it. But notice how consistent it is with the gospel, Jacob, right?
Yeah, I
Hey,
mean,
let's start to make some changes. Let's make some adjustments. Don't be crazy. This isn't about saying you have to change everything. It's like, be wise, make adjustments, and just know that things can start to change even physiologically. Our neuroplasticity and our genes can start to manifest differently. If you have a story of like, oh, my family was this way and my family will always be this way, this is not the case. Our genes can actually turn on and off depending on what we do or don't do. Sorry,
yeah.
that was long.
No, that's great. And that it's funny that you say that because I agree. I don't think that my genes predetermine where I'm going to be. They just give me a propensity that if I don't do anything, I'll roll down the hill that direction because I'm tilted in that direction.
Yeah, yeah.
And as I've explored this, so it's funny. I read a book called Play It Away. It was about the subject of anxiety. And there's a guy that basically was just telling his story about kind of nothing was working. And then I forget what he did. He started playing some sport. I think it was like softball or something. And he noticed that he felt really great afterwards. And I personally, I had just discovered the practice of meditation and kind of mindfulness and stuff. And I noticed that that helped me. It helped me to feel better. It helped me to kind of, I always kind of tell people it's kind of like you clean out everything out of your head when you do that. And there's
Mm-hmm.
something, it's almost like a reset,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like you got to clean your room, otherwise it gets cluttered and gross, and all of a sudden you got mold growing behind your dresser or something. Where when you declutter it and you kind of clean it all out, it's kind of like you have a fresh start.
Yeah.
And so I've often told people, again, I'm looking for ways outside of sort of medication stuff that can do it. And obviously, exercise, sleep, food, that kind of stuff. Other things, though, if as I continue to build that list, formal meditation, like actual formal meditative, like a meditation app or something. I found that that helped me. And so I began to look at what else. And this book that was talking about Play It Away is why that matters. I made the connection myself because at that time I was actually boxing. Now I'm doing jujitsu, and I always say it's like jujitsu is like therapy for me. It, I feel like mentally better after I do it. Not just like my body might even hurt, but I feel way better. And what I found, and you might be able to clarify this, just my own personal kind of experience, is that play is something that brings you into that moment. I was boxing at the time that I first was doing this. When you're in a ring with someone who's going to punch you in the face, like your mind is not in the future, it's not in the past, it's you are present. And mindfulness is kind of about becoming fully present, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I found that there are a bunch of things like that. We all kind of know these things that when you're doing them, it's like the whole world disappears,
Yeah.
right? And that's extremely good for your mental health. And then again, as I sort of was thinking about how this all works, I was like, it seems that if my mind is in the future, I'm anxious because the future is a land of the unknown. And then if my mind is in the past, I'm depressed. And it's funny because I realized this because I saw it in my own family. I thought the past was made depression because like you had regrets about the past, and actually, what I found, again, you're the expert here. I'm just kind of saying what I've found as I've sort of explored this stuff, is that a lot of times when your mind is in the past, you have I coined the term good old day syndrome. I have relatives that kind of look back at the past in their lives and like, man, those were such good times, and then it sort of robs them of it can't get better than that.
Mm-hmm.
Like now and the future doesn't look as good as the past. And so I kind of have this depression because it's like the best days are behind me sort of thing. And I don't know. I mean, I'm no expert in this, but what do you think? Am I on the right track at least?
You definitely are. And kudos to you for being open to, even trying different things. There is sort of a fear among some people, maybe some believers, some Christians, that mindfulness meditation is sort of like taking us outside of our tradition. But as you know, and I think this is essential to your platform, wherever truth exists, that's our religion, right? That we can embrace truth wherever it comes from. That you mentioned the kind of clearing out that happens for you when you do
Yeah.
this. My question is, imagine if 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 that happened every time you prayed, and every time you opened the scriptures, and every Sabbath day. Like, imagine if our spiritual practices were had the same kind of mindful clearing as the meditations, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not often that's not always how people experience spiritual practices, but I think you already know this has been a long-standing interest of mine. How can the things that we already do, and they're not just spiritual practice, but how about family dinner? You sit down with your kids. What if family dinner could have this element of presence? I've been trying to teach my kids. I tell them, let's not eat like Vikings here. And then run off. Part of dinner is visiting together. Because they're like, I'm done, I'm going. No, no, hold on now. Let's talk. Let's like, what's going on? And maybe even taste your food.
Yeah.
In our mindfulness classes, we give them a mindful meal as homework. I want you to just take a meal where you actually smell your food, Food sometimes has sounds to it, snap, crackle, pop, not just fajitas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Smell, like be present, and sort of the European dining where we're like present. And in a similar way, could we actually feast on scripture? I think you know what this is. Like, could you actually relish a text and take some space before and after and like sit with it? And then instead of kneeling down and just launching into words, can you actually be still so that the stuff settles inside? And if people experienced their faith in that same way, no one would ever walk away from it. It would be as powerful or more than meditation. It would have that same clearing effect, but instead of just being still, we're still before God, right?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because at first when you were bringing it up, one of the things in mindfulness is to kind of, at least, and maybe this is my misunderstanding of it, is that it has so much of a clearing effect. It's kind of like, just focus on your breathing. But I have realized, and even now as I think of it now, you are putting something in there that you're focusing on. That sort of like the you're noticing that tree over there, right? For
Yeah,
anyone who's done meditation type
yeah,
practices, you are you're not judging a lot of that stuff, but you're being present with things. And like you're saying, and I have found meals are another one of those things that are, I've realized that oftentimes, like, oh, I got to eat because I got to do this, got to do that, got to do that, got to do this. And it's like, wait a minute, stop for a second. I made myself, for the first time, I'm terrible at making steaks. So finally one day I was like, I'm going to make a good steak. I'm going to watch like a Gordon Ramsay video about how to make a good steak. And so I watched a YouTube video. You guys can probably find it. It's the first one that pops up. Put Gordon Ramsay, how to make a perfect steak. It was the best steak I've ever had in my life. It was so good. And I remember, though, I did everything. Like, I prepared the plate, I got everything there, and I was like fully, like you're saying, present with the meal. And I really enjoyed it.
yeah,
And I think that we live in a world where we're never present. We're always worrying about the next thing or got to do something. And so when you're never present, I think your mind is not meant to go like like that all the time.
yeah. So in that case, that steak was your anchor. Like we call it an anchor in mindfulness practice. The breath is usually the anchor. Okay, if your mind wanders off, bring it back to the breath, right? Because the breath is always with you.
Yeah.
But really cool that you allowed the steak to actually like ground you instead of just rah, 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 Cookie Monster style. Just you relish and treasure something. Imagine your whole life being that way, Jacob. In the first session of our mindfulness class, we use a raisin. We spend 20 minutes eating a raisin. Seriously. And
20 minutes? Wow.
people are like,
That's
I paid
hardcore.
people are like, I paid money for this class. But there's a point. If we can actually take 20 minutes and have discoveries about a raisin, like, oh my goodness, I didn't know this, but like blah 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 blah. How about your child? How about your spouse? How about your neighbor? How about that guy on the elevator that you just kind of like blow past? Like these are infinitely beautiful human beings. And how about every experience? And so to bring it, when we approach life as like a to-do list, even sacred things become a to-do list. Even dinner, even date night, we get in a doing mode of mind. What I get excited about, what if everything can be an opportunity to stop, to be still, to be present? If you don't mind me mentioning it, we have a follow-up to the Power of Stillness that just came out at Deseret Book called The Practice of Stillness. And we take all these different things that we do in the gospel, and sometimes we do them and we get in this quick mode, I'm just going to get this done. What if everything was an excuse to do what you're describing? And like in church, this moment where you're like, oh, the speaker is boring, whatever, like I'm going to like wander off. Well, guess what? What if the speaker's words and the actual message was an anchor? And even if they're boring, in meditation, we intentionally try to be boring. Did you know that? We reduce everything but the breath, because it's really good to practice. So if you actually have a boring talk at church, it's a perfect chance to practice this. All right, my mind is wandering off. Bring it back to the message, the words. Bring it back. I think ordinances, like there's a reason that we have bread and water and like water, etc. It's very physical. We can bring back to what we're actually doing. Anyway, that's what we talk about in this book.
Well, it's funny because, and you say kind of focus on this thing, be still. I wrote down the word here, experience. It's like really experience something. And to truly experience something, like you have to be present with it. You have to fully sort of relish in it. I remember on my mission, something happened. So I served in Argentina, and I was in this area that was kind of like the Great Plains of Argentina. And the sunsets there were just awesome. And my thing is, I never noticed sunsets much in my life. And now, even now when I'm really busy. And I remember this, I like literally looked forward to the sunsets because I had so much less sort of distractions in my life at that time, and certain pleasures that were kind of like cheap. When you're listening to pop music all the time and you're kind of flooded with all these stimuli, you sometimes lose the ability. It's kind of like if you eat candy all the time, eventually you're just like, you don't notice it. It doesn't taste great. But man, if you go with no sugar for like a month and then you have a strawberry, that thing tastes like a
Yeah,
bag of Skittles. It's
yeah,
like, and the taste just explodes off. But we live in this world that it's like we're being given dopamine hits and candy. It's kind of like candy all the time. And that's so unhealthy. And I think that when we are present with things, we end up, it's like we actually have the ability to taste the sugar again. You know what I mean? It's like all of a sudden a strawberry is really great
just the
because
strawberry. Yep.
it's not this thing. And some people might try and, this is all just a bunch of like psychology mumbo jumbo. But Jesus Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, his most famous sermon of all time, says, "Think ye therefore, no, take ye therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." In other words, quit stressing about the past and the future.
Hmm.
Be present here, now. And the thing that comes to me whenever I do this is gratitude. That's the overwhelming emotion. I begin to find that the simplest things can bring me immense joy, like
Yeah,
a strawberry. It's a really weird thing.
dude, this is not peripheral. This is not secondary. Just to sort of riff off what you're saying, the same Sermon on the Mount, before he gave it, Jesus went away in silence, just like in The Chosen. They didn't make that up. Read the actual scriptures. He left. He got away. And when we think about what would Jesus do, often it's like, well, he would do more. He would go serve. He would teach something. He would be helping somebody. 9 different times in the New Testament, he leaves. He gets away. He steps away. And after John the Baptist died, he goes away. Sometimes it's in the desert. Sometimes it's in a garden. Sometimes it's on a lake. Sometimes it's early in the morning. Sometimes it's late at night. There's one translation of the book of Mark that says he often went and found stillness. So I think, to those that are nervous about this as being somehow out of our tradition, that is like so false. Like and I'm speaking to those in your audience who are Christian, you couldn't have a better foundation for this, and Jesus' own life. And of course, he didn't just go away to be silent and still. He went to commune with Abba, to be with his Father. So that's the element of a Christian approach to this, that it's not just being with our thoughts and our breath. It's a chance to commune with the one who calls himself the great I am. His name is not I was or I will be. I am. He's present. And like you, I find him in the present moment. If I get lost into the future or the past, that's more difficult.
It's funny. Love, in a certain way, is this made me think of the word love, because when you love someone, you're truly present with them. Like that's kind of, if you're thinking about the, and if you think about it in terms of romantic love, and obviously there's different kinds, but like when you're with that person, you lose track all the time. All of a sudden it's 4 a.m. and you're like, oh my gosh, like we've been out like all night talking or hanging out. And it's because you were truly there with them. In fact, the best moments of your life are the times that are, they ultimately were almost timeless. Time seemed to, because you were just so invested in that moment and you were experiencing that moment at its fullest. Like that's what real living is. That's when you really feel alive. And sort of, I would say that the promise of the Savior is that it is to be fully alive. I think it was C.S. Lewis even who I believe it was him who said something along those lines, that that's what Christ is trying to give you, is so that you're not just merely alive, but that you have life, that you're not just another thing that exists. And
Jake,
one thing on that, and I'll give it back to
hey,
you.
Jacob,
Is,
really quick.
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Are you hearing that in the background? Somebody turned on something. I was gonna go turn it off.
I'm not really hearing it. So your
Okay,
microphone's sensitive enough that it's not picking it
let's
up.
let's keep going. Can I respond to what you said, and you can
Yeah,
just
yeah, go
correct?
ahead, go ahead.
Well, you're describing really well the abundant life too, and like this richness of peace and joy. That, again, I think there are a lot of people walking around going, I don't feel it. I don't feel it. But it's there. We can find this. And I believe more stillness, silence, mindfulness, the very thing you're describing, I think it can be a vehicle to reach some of that. Whereas just doing more, just trying harder, just muscling your way through, like packing more stuff in. Sometimes I think God wants us to just do less, like stop, And if he came to you and said, Jacob, if he came to you and said, I want you to do this great, mighty thing, you'd probably say yes. But if he comes and says, I want you to do less, I think that's actually hard for
Yeah,
us.
yeah. Well, we tend to think that if things aren't right, that means I need to do more to fix it.
Yeah.
Right? If something isn't right, then we need to add more things to the plate. Um, Now that is a very, and I have this written down. I've written down the hedonic treadmill. Okay, the constant need for more pleasure to feel the same amount of satisfaction that you have. I always say that the easiest analogy to this is candy. When you're a kid, to have a piece of candy is like the greatest thing in the world. So you think, I want to eat candy. What
Hmm.
happens? As you grow up, you realize, I don't want to eat candy all the time. I want to have a little bit of candy every once in a while, something sweet. But to just have like, well, for the next week, all you're going to eat is candy, is like, that's like torture. It's horrible. And one of the big reasons why is because people who seek life, more thrills, more. I genuinely think part of the mental health crisis that's happening in the world is because of our enormous abundance. People are actually able to start fulfilling those hedonic sort of
Yeah.
impulses. I want to travel. I want to sleep around. I want to do all these different things. I want to drink and party and have all this stuff. And then they have it. And then what happens is then it gets duller and duller and duller until eventually it's like nothing satisfies them. And life itself is just a painful, miserable, there's nothing here to fulfill me anymore because I've already sort of, like, the candy doesn't taste good anymore and there's nothing besides candy out there for me to eat. And that's what they think. And then they end up in this dark place. And I read about the CEO of Zappos, the famous shoe company, a terrible tragic story where he took his life. And I read he wrote a book where he talked about kind of how he had made it to the top of the higher of his dream, like take the company public and have millions and millions of dollars. Like, you did it, you're a big successful entrepreneur, like this is what he dreamed of. And he got to the top of the mountain and then he was like, oh no,
Mm.
like this is all it is. Like, this is it. I don't like, and it caused just an absolute crisis. And I think that many of us at one point or another, like there's great joy in sort of pursuing something. And then once you get it, it's almost like it kills you. But the problem is we're constantly trying to pursue that next thing instead of looking around us and just being amongst the wonder and beauty that is our own life.
Oh, preach it, brother. If I could like shout an amen to what you're saying. Listen, I think what you just articulated really effectively could be like a central key to the many, many people who are grappling with all sorts of addictive compulsive patterns. And I believe most human beings have at least one, some more socially
I
acceptable
probably
than
have
others.
more.
Right? Like if I could rephrase like what you're saying, there's something even better than candy constantly. Now I like candy every once in a while. Don't get me wrong. Like, we do the trick or treating thing here too.
Yeah.
But candy all the time, um, and in the work I've done with people who struggle with pornography, and I know a lot of, and not just men, but women. We've had 15,000 women come to us at Fortify. Like one of the things that gets them out of it is when they realize there is something better than porn. It's called the richness of a loving human relationship. It's called the peace of being able to be in this beautiful family and serve and not feel like this rawness inside, right? And people can learn that for themselves. You want to know how? By being present. And actually, like, when people struggle with something like pornography, my advice to them is, instead of just beating yourself up and like, I don't know, I gotta like force myself, notice how you feel, really, afterwards. Just like, I actually created a meditation on pornography, like a mindfulness practice, like, feel, what is it like? Do you love that emptiness inside? Notice how it feels. And this actually came out of my wife was teaching a class to women who were struggling with overeating. And she gave them this assignment. She said, go home and eat whatever you want, but I want you to pay close attention to how you feel. And this lady came back and she ate this big love-it size of peanut butter M&Ms. That was the forbidden fruit, right? That was her pornography, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And she came back and said, I don't think I actually like it as much as I thought. Because she noticed for the first time her own body. She noticed how sick the too many peanut butter M&Ms made her. Now a few was different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the cool thing is we can learn from our own experience what is actually good, what is true, what is wonderful. And I think if people did what you're describing, if they were present to everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, our own lives would teach us so much. Does that make any sense?
Oh, and it's funny because I feel like that's so at the end of King Benjamin's speech. I actually just went over this with the youth that I teach seminary to. See, I had a guy first mention this, and then I realized this scripture teaches the same principle. He was a guy who actually had been excommunicated from the church. When he was much younger. He's an older guy by this point. And he said, for a lot of my life, I felt like I had to, it was all about like effort. Like, I'm just going to try really hard to like not do bad things. And then he realized that what he actually needed to do wasn't that, it was to surrender. And there's that scripture in Mosiah where King Benjamin, the people who've heard him, they say, we felt the Spirit, the Lord omnipotent, and we have no more disposition to do evil, but to do good continually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, whoa, like what if you could change so that you didn't have to struggle at all?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then as I read the New Testament and we studied that for seminary last year, and I was really digging into it, and I realized there's this theme that just is constantly over and over, and it's about the gift of the Holy Ghost, this transforming power of the Spirit that's really what we're supposed to do. It's not the law of the Old Testament, which is like, just try really hard. It's more like, no, surrender to Jesus Christ, let his spirit into your life, and he'll change you from the inside out through that sort of a transformation. I think, if I'm not mistaken, what you're talking about is very much that sort of an approach that says, going inside and being present, you will notice the good from the evil and be able to make change because your own soul will recognize it and it will no longer desire that which is evil.
That is a mighty change. And Jacob, I have witnessed that in my own loved ones. My wife has been experiencing a mighty shift. I've been experiencing it partly with our daughter's situation, but we also just are in the middle of a research study where we've gathered any story we can find of someone who has actually found lasting freedom from pornography. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is anyone who's actually found healing from depression that is like permanent, like long term. We're going to only listen to the stories of people who have found this real healing, right? And you want to know the common theme?
Yes, I do.
Well, certainly there are a lot of patterns, right? People
Yeah.
have done this with cancer too. Kelly Turner did this with cancer, where she took every story of anybody that's gotten healed from cancer and she found these patterns. You can look her up. But there are a number of patterns. But the one that stood out to me most is most everybody who has reached this sort of promised land, right? They're really doing well. They're not struggling constantly. They've had some kind of internal change that just didn't just happen. It's not just like just add water. They had some experience with the divine that shifted them so much that they're different. They're different human beings. And my own wife has had a similar experience with anxiety. She's dealt with anxiety for a long time. She's different. She's like does not struggle the same way before. And I like to share this with people because so often people who struggle with depression, anxiety, and the addiction, they hear like, this is going to be your life, you know? It's probably going to be a lifelong thing. You're always going to have to deal with this. And for some people, for whatever reasons, they might, it might go on for a long time. But if they don't have any hope that things can be different, that alone can be a very depressing thing. So there's a lot of hope out there, kind of bringing this full circle. There's hope for people who have even had long-term struggles that really mighty changes can happen.
Yeah. And I think, see, we in the church, and even me in particular, especially on my channel, I talk a lot about the moral life, right? The idea is talking about things that are right and wrong, and we kind of operate in that space. But I think we sometimes, and maybe this is a good reminder, is that that is not the only part of what we are as Latter-day Saints, as human beings, as children of God. There is a spiritual, mental, physical, moral, like all of these dimensions of who we are all important.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we can over focus on one at the expense of others. But to have kind of this abundant life, to become as Christ would have us be, it's sort of like you have to take all of them into account. And when it comes to sort of the mental, and I want to get your thoughts on this real quick, because this is it's a little change in the topic maybe, but do you know what the Greek or what the root word psyche, where it comes from?
Not off the top of my head, no.
So I researched this. It comes from, I believe it's Greek for soul.
Mm.
Psychology is the logos, study of the soul in a certain way. Now, I do believe that there's a lot of complexities in the mind-body problem and the connection between all of it. We as Latter-day Saints have a very, we don't have the minds over here and the bodies over here, and the spirit. It's all kind of in one thing in a way. But I bring that up because I have a hard time distinguishing between what is good for my spirit and what is good for my mental health.
Mm.
It seems to be that what's going on in psychology is an exploration of human consciousness, which is how much different from saying the human spirit or the human soul. I don't know. What do you think about that? The connection between sort of the psychological and the spiritual.
Well, there's definitely, I mean, if it's genuinely good for your mental health, it's probably going to be genuinely good for the soul. The one qualification would be there's all sorts of advice coming out of psychology that, from a spiritual perspective, seems kind of undermining. A big example I wrote about this just before Thanksgiving is all the talk about boundaries, right? Like, for your mental health, Jacob, if you're uncomfortable with someone, you really need to draw better boundaries.
But is
It's
and is that, and I think that's a complex topic, and I can see where there probably is some truth to that. But also, it isn't good for your mental health to have just, I'm just going to draw boundaries around everyone that makes me like uncomfortable.
right. Of course, that's sort of like we can straw man the whole thing. Um, but it's gotten out of control, I believe. I mean, I spoke to grandparents who are just like cut off from their grandkids because they're like their grandkids have these boundaries and their children have these boundaries, right? And certainly, if somebody's abusive, if somebody's like,
Yeah,
Nephi is like, I'm getting away from Laman and Lemuel,
yeah,
there's a boundary there. That's different than like your grandparents who maybe share different politics or maybe even a different perspective on your faith. Like there's almost a new divorce revolution going on between parents and children. I think
yep.
it's heartbreaking stories. If I could, you mentioned something at the beginning that I think I also want to return to. You mentioned how your brother had said everybody has anxiety. There is an interpretation of that early verse in Genesis that says, "By the sweat of our face we will eat our bread all the days of our life."
Mm-hmm.
There's actually some who believe that that's not referring to physical sweat.
Hmm.
It's referring to stress.
Hmm.
Like by the stress, we're going to have to live in
Oh, and
our work is going to
I
involve stress for all of us.
yeah, and I think that that's absolutely true. I think and I would agree with that interpretation. That story is trying to convey that human beings, part of the nature of being in the fallen world, is you're gonna have to deal with crap,
That's
like
right.
having to grow your food if you lived a long time ago, and like watch out for winter because you might starve to death.
Yeah.
So, but what would you say? So I have some things on here for people who want to um, improve their mental health without having to resort um, to medications and things like that. Kind of the good diet and exercise routine for it. One of them is literally diet and exercise helps your mental health. Sleep. Um, I put on here play. I don't know if you disagree with that. Getting out and doing things that actually bring you into the present moment. I sometimes refer to them as meditative activities because
Hmm.
they tend to do that. But as you said, just do that in your everyday with everything that you can. Be present more just in general. Is that one that you'd add to that list?
For sure. Yeah. You're describing the adventure. Like you start to go on an adventure of like, how do you actually create a lifestyle and a home that counteracts these risk factors? Because we're living in this petri dish. University of Washington researchers say we're living in a depressogenic society. It's like it gives birth to depression. And the cool thing is we can set up our homes and our lives to counteract that, to neutralize that. So our children, our, you know, our everyone in our family actually has an experience that does the opposite, kind of an antidepressant lifestyle.
Hmm.
And you described some of them. Um, I I want to provide some physiological reason to be hopeful. Some of the latest data on depression shows that inflammation in the body is tied to depression. The same stuff when you get the flu if you examine your body, it's inflamed, right? Well, it's not actually a chemical imbalance that is connected to depression. Neuroscientists don't actually believe that anymore. What the research shows is inflammation. So all the same kinds of things you would do when you're sick with the flu, they would help. So when I talk to somebody who's in a mental health crisis, I tell them, I want you to take some time and live differently. I want you to baby yourself. I want you to pay for a salad bar. I want you to take some time off. I want you to listen to music and literature and be around people that are soothing to you. And anything that has been soothing and uplifting in the past, I want you to do double and triple of. Linus Pauling is actually, he won the Nobel Prize, but he argued that even doubling and tripling your intake of vitamins, like the stuff that we know is good for us, is also good for your mental health. So this is a very hopeful message, Jacob.
Yeah.
Because it says there's 100 things that can contribute to your level of depression. I mean, like even living closer to a freeway, it like raises your risk of depression just a little bit. That
Well,
means there's 100 things we can do to like move in the better direction. And there's not just one thing. There's not just one cause. There's not just one solution. There's 100 things that can kind of move us in the good direction.
So there's two thoughts here. One is that it seems that, and this is what I'm imagining is the case, is that depression and anxiety, which are the two, if I'm not mistaken, the two kind of most common things that people experience, right? Schizophrenia is not something that everyone's dealing with, but anxiety and depression are kind of ubiquitous, and the matter is how out of control do these get? So in dealing with those seem to be emergent from some more fundamental causes. And what you're saying is that those causes can be quite complex. They can deal with everything from diet to life situations that you have to the way that you process the stimuli of your own life. So this variety of different factors. So what we're seeing with I'm feeling depressed or I'm feeling anxious, it isn't like, it's sort of like, okay, it's kind of like my car's making a funny noise. That could be any number of things. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. My favorite metaphor to use is, have you ever played SimCity?
Yeah.
So if you were king over a society and you wanted to make them depressed, what would you do, right? I love to ask this question at the beginning of like a group and hear everybody's most dastardly plans, Dark Lord plans.
Is that an actual ask? Are you actually asking me that? Think about
You
that.
could make people depressed. Think about it. Like, okay, all right, you can't eat real food. Everybody stays inside. We're going to estrange people from relationships. Funny ideas, you can't drink real water. It's just all sugar water now. And
You can't solve any of your own problems. They're all caused by other people. So you're
yeah,
totally hopeless.
and at some point in the game, here's the magical moment. At some point, people are like, hold on now. This isn't just a game. We're living in a society that in so many ways sets us up. And Stephen Alardi says, our brains were never designed for a society that was this fast-paced and superficial and da-da-da. You start to add it up. Sedentary life. I think one day we're going to look back and say, 100 years from now, people are going to be like, can you believe they sat at a desk for like 8 to 10 hours and it killed them? You and I are probably going to die younger because of our professions, but
Yeah.
this is a hopeful message, because then people can go on an adventure and like, okay, what can you do in your own home with your own children or your own life and make little adjustments? It's hard to go to bed earlier. It doesn't just it's not just a willpower thing. You have to get up earlier and then set your schedule. But if you do, you're like moving your mental health that much more forward, and it's hard to make adjustments.
It's funny you talked about this idea of soothing and doing these things that are very, very nice for you for someone who's in a crisis. And I totally think that that's exactly right. Now, I have and you can correct me if I'm wrong. You're the expert here, not me. But I think that it's kind of like when a person is injured, yeah, you have them go lay in bed and like heal the wound. But I don't usually take my child and just keep them in bed all the time and just, oh, here, I'm just going to make you, and this will make you have good mental health by just constantly giving you soothing babiness. There's a sense in which by having people do hard things, they build emotional resilience.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, it's kind of like your child. If my child is sick or injured, I'm going to put them in bed. I'm going to soothe them. I'm going to say, honey, like, let me just take care of every little thing and all of that. But once they're better, I'm going to tell them, now, let's get out there and, like my boy plays football, like get out there and make a tackle. And don't you be lazy when you run your laps and all of that. With the idea being that, and using kind of the physical health analogy, that by strengthening him through challenge, he's less likely to actually end up injured or sick.
Beautiful. I mean, I again, this is what happens when we get together. I agree with what you're saying. Can you tell me to stop playing the piano, please? Sorry, my boy is
No, you're fine.
to play the piano right in the middle of the interview. So, what I described earlier about like babying yourself, I'm referring specifically to an acute phase of like a crisis, where people don't realize that if they really do that and bundle up, as it were, it can reduce inflammation in the body. Norwegian countries in the winter, you know this, they do this hygge, and slippers and tea and warm blankets, and they double or triple all the comforting things in the winter, and it helps them get through the hard time. But once you're at the other side, you're right, like that's not a good sustainable thing. So on the short term, that's good. Long term, you got to get in the ice bath. Intentionally stretch yourself. We have a horse trough in our backyard that we fill with water, and then we jump in the ice bath. My boys do it, testing yourself, stretching yourself, exposing yourself to challenging situations. I have a friend that says, I go to church to be uncomfortable. He's Episcopalian. He says, I go to church because if I just stay in my own thoughts and worship, I don't really test myself, but being around people that have different thoughts, it stretches you.
And I've thought a lot about this because of Jordan Peterson and his work. Like he's very, very big on this therapy of actually voluntarily exposing yourself to things that make you uncomfortable, and that's actually how you build real like strength. So that way you're not a sickly person that can't handle anything who ends up in bed all the time. Whereas we have a certain people in society that think of therapy as like, oh, you just like the best therapy in the world is just to like hang out in bed and be coddled and cuddled and told everything's great, where actually maybe therapy is more like, I remember I ran track in high school, and I played football and did other things. And I think the hardest thing I ever did in all of my kind of athletic career was I was a quarter-mile runner. I ran the 4x400, and that race sucks. It is super hard in the sense that you are just like you basically run until your legs don't work anymore. Like it's supposed to be a sprint, 400 meters, which is basically about as far as you can go at a full sprint. And even then, like the last 100 meters are just like the worst experience of your life. And I remember our coach, there were certain practices where we'd run 400 meters. We had to do them in under 60 seconds. And then we only got one lap of jogging in between. And I remember those days sucked so bad. They were so miserable. I remember in school, in my last class, feeling sick to my stomach, knowing that I was going to go do those. But after doing them and having that experience, I sort of had this realization that like, if I can do that, if I can take my body and do something that I just do not want to do, and I can push through it and make it to the other side, you know what? Maybe I can do hard things. and it built in me a level of confidence, because I think we talk about self-esteem as if it's something that's given by people telling you how wonderful you are when you know you're not. No, self-esteem is something that you earn when you impress yourself, when you do something and you say, I did something that I realized was hard and I did it voluntarily. And
Hmm.
so I think we live in a world where so many people have thought about therapy in terms of the acute therapy that's necessary for someone who is like the kid who just broke his leg and has a fever of 105 and needs to lay in bed. And yeah, that's the kind of care they need. But for most of us who aren't in the midst of a mental health crisis, what we need is to strengthen ourselves so that we don't have those crises.
Yeah. Amen again. And if I could just elaborate, you're describing a physical challenge that taught you can do something hard. One of the hardest things emotionally and mentally is to face the truth that that is uncomfortable
Yeah.
to you, right? And the truth can be painful to really. You talk about being present. It's a lot easier to hide from the truth sometimes and just to push it away. And one of the things I've been fascinated by recently is if you look at repentance and you look at trauma healing, right? Repentance is for things that we did that we know were wrong. Trauma healing, things that were done to us, like
Yeah.
terrible things, like the stories coming out of Syria. One of the fascinating things is at the center of both of these practices is facing reality. Living, Dan Ellsworth says, living in reality. You actually have to see the truth of what happened to you or what you did before you can actually change or heal. Both of them are kinds of healing. Alternatively, if we avoid the truth and push it away and deny it, like, I don't want to even think about that, we're just going to stay stuck. So it's hard to look at the truth about our own lives sometimes. Look in the mirror and say, I've gotta look at this. But when I kneel down and pray, that's almost always what the Spirit's telling me. I've never knelt down and had the Spirit say, yeah, your wife really needs to change that. Never once. It's always like, or your boy really needs to fix that. It's always looking back at something I need to be in reality with. So be present.
Absolutely.
Thank you
So,
for this. This is a fun
so,
conversation.
so as we kind of wrap this up, one thought that I've had is that has changed. I always thought, in the past, luckily, mental health has become more, for better or for worse, it's becoming more kind of ubiquitously talked about and understood by kind of everyone. And I think that it's led to both people having really dumb mental health practices, kind of over coddling people maybe to one extent, but at least people are talking about it. And I'm hoping that as we all do that and have conversations like these, it can become more clear. But I used to think, and a lot of people have this, is sort of mental health is something for those people that are like going to a therapist because they're in crisis, and I'm not in crisis, therefore mental health isn't relevant to me. And I
Hmm.
think the biggest paradigm shift that I had was when I started to realize that I have my own mental health that can be to any degree better or worse. It's just like my physical health. And that I, if I'm not aware of it and proactive about
Hmm.
my own mental health and building that resilience and putting together good practices of sleep, food, exercise, social connection, meditative practice, being present, all of that kind of stuff. If I'm not doing the diet and exercise version of mental health, which is, the stuff that you do naturally to keep yourself in a good headspace, then I may end up with a crisis. And I also just live a less enjoyable life because I'm less mentally well than I could be. And I guess my question to you as a professional is, to those out there who aren't in a crisis right now, what would you say to them is, like, if you give one piece of advice to someone on taking care of their mental health, of all the different things that we mentioned, is there something in particular that you think is the most important?
Um, when we looked at all the people who have come to us at Impact Suite, where I worked with Clay, and we analyzed all the different lifestyle factors, the number one predictor of depression was a lack of meaning and purpose, of all of them. it had the most significant effect. So after seeing all these stories of people healing, I think if you change your diet and sleep and, de-stress and connect with people and have no sense of your place in the universe, and that there's a higher meaning to things and purpose, and maybe even connecting with the living God, you're still skimming over the surface of mental health. The abundant life, even if you're not so depressed, I would ask, do you have deep joy in your life? Do you have exquisite peace like that passeth all understanding? You can have it. And even all the anger that goes around, people are so angry. We don't have to be angry. We can disagree deeply. We can raise our voices. And these are the things that are available to those that take the spiritual path, the path of faith seriously, as you do. Your whole channel is dedicated to this. There is so much more joy and peace and love available. My wife has dealt with anxiety for much of her life. Jacob, I've been witnessing her having a mighty change of healing, where she is feeling peace and joy and love. It's miraculous. So I just read in Moroni that, this morning, there really is a God of miracles out there. And so I think the biggest thing is reaching beyond your own thoughts to encounter the living God and encounter a purpose and meaning that goes way beyond what's happening at work, way beyond whatever career or this or that. Do you know how much you matter to this God, And the answer that many people would give is no. I mean, I have a friend, I asked him the other day, I'll end here. I said, have you ever, he's an old fogey like me. I said, have you ever experienced sweetness and peace from repentance, from the burden of sin coming off of your shoulders? And you know what he told me?
What?
Never. It's always been guilt and shame. And it blew me away. I love this person. He's a dear friend. And he's never actually felt that transcendence of God actually cleaning you out and helping you start fresh, right? That's the whole gospel to me. Mm-hmm. That's the message of Jesus. Tomorrow doesn't have to be the same as today. I can fall on my face and make a mistake. And that old Anne of Green Gables, we can start fresh with no mistakes. I will make all things new, he says in the book of Revelation. What a fun conversation, man. Every time I talk with you, it's whoa. This has been great.
Feelings mutual. I always enjoy our conversations. Well, everybody, real quick, let's remind everybody again, you have the card game. Everyone should go check that out. Give us a website one more time.
Oh, yeah. trainyourpuppygame.com, www.trainyourpuppygame. And this book, The Practice of Stillness, out at Deseret Book, it does break down a lot of how we can approach these spiritual practices in a mindful way. It's really been a fun thing to write. So,
absolutely. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Jacob.
Thanks for your time.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.